Hello and welcome to this video book and an introduction to the sweet spot of internal communication, which can help you take your career to a new level by giving you a systemic approach to developing your team's influence, confidence and business impact. In these first 4 chapters, we'll explore where you're starting from, particularly some of the long-standing challenges internal communication specialists so often face. We'll look at how a fresh perspective on old issues may be useful. We'll start mapping out a systemic approach that can help you reach the sweet spot, which is the overall goal of this book, and to set up the rest of the book, we'll end this introduction by defining 2 demonstrably valid purposes for internal communication. So let's begin with your current situation. Finding the sweet spot of internal communication is really important if you want to be able to fulfill your true potential, but can't currently do so because of things that aren't entirely in your control. These are just a few examples, and obviously you may have other challenges of your own, but you may recognize some of these. In fact, if you want, you could pause this VBook now and spend a few moments seeing how many of them you can identify with. And if you think about the issues you recognize, it might be useful to consider this question. Just how long have these issues been part of your life? Were they not there at the beginning of last year? Or even the year before? In fact, I first put this list together in 1996, so it's clear that these issues seem always to have been with us. But so what? Well, what if we were to stop and think about just who's benefiting from these issues? Are you and your team? Or do they not sap your resources and add frustration and even stress into some of your days? And how about the people you're working for? 1 or 2 of these issues may seem to benefit them in the short term, but longer term, surely they're losing out too. And what about the impact these issues could be having on the people who need to receive and use the communications, or your organization as a whole? Surely these issues can only be a drag on its operating costs, reputation, and market position. So it seems that whichever of these and other issues you recognize, you and the people you work with have actually inherited a lose-lose-lose-lose situation. It's not really anyone's fault as such, but it does raise a couple of questions. Given that there seem to be no real winners from these issues, we could ask ourselves, why on earth do we put up with them? But would the answer to that question really help us that much? Or might we be better off asking what we can do to bring these issues to an end? And that different question may require us to look at those old challenges with fresh eyes. Maybe we need to look at the very system we've inherited and work out where the changes need to be made. Well, interestingly, it seems that many people, even though the current situation is clearly an unhealthy one, often push back against the idea of changing it. Some believe it would be simply too hard, and maybe they wouldn't even know where to start. Others are concerned that it would take forever and that they simply can't afford the time to do the necessary work, partly because of the time these very issues are costing them. Of course, they might be able to find the time if they had more people or could buy in the expertise to do it for them, but maybe they don't have the budget for that. And even if they could find the time or budget, some people believe they'd never be able to get others to change because there are too many egos involved. And in many ways, all of these are perfectly valid objections. However, as Albert Einstein once observed, no problem can be solved at the level of consciousness that created it. Of course, the term consciousness is bandied about by a lot of people and seems to have so many different meanings that I feel it would be useful to specify what Einstein was getting at here. For me, it seems logical to suggest that he was actually talking about perception or perspective. So what could happen if we were to raise our level of perception? Maybe we'd find that it could be easy to make the necessary changes now, and perhaps relatively quickly with very little time investment on your part. Of course, anything might be possible if you could throw enough money at it. But if cost is the issue, maybe a higher perspective could also show us that those changes could be not just cheap to make, but actually turn a profit for your employer. Maybe the necessary investment could be massively outstripped by the returns it could deliver, and that you could know this before you even start. And could this new perspective also tell us that, far from threatening people's egos, these changes could actually make everybody feel better about themselves because they're more empowered and the results are making everybody's lives better? In short, with some subtle shifts in our thinking, we have it within us to turn that lose-lose-lose-lose situation into a win-win-win-win. Now, I appreciate this may sound like a bit of a pipe dream at the moment, but we're only just getting started. So what is this systemic approach I'm advocating? Well, it requires three factors to come together in order to support your performance. Now, interestingly, you already have all three. The question is, though, are they all demonstrably fit for purpose? Firstly, we have to consider the practices you're using, which need to have been designed properly. And by practices, we mean things like your briefing process, how you get things approved and signed off, the way you seek and manage feedback, the quality of any style guides you may be following, your message calendar, and all manner of other procedures and tools you may be using. Now, even if all your practices are designed to be demonstrably fit for purpose, they're not going to work that well unless everyone who needs to use them has the necessary skills to do so. Crucially, though, even with those skills, you're still not going to be able to add the kind of value you could unless you also have a mandate which is going to enable you to use those fit-for-purpose practices and skills. So if any one of these three is less healthy than it needs to be, then neither you nor anyone else involved in internal communication is going to be able to perform as well as possible. And if you recognize any of these issues, we can be pretty certain that at least one of these three must currently be unfit for purpose. So this is what we really need to address, because it's only when all three are fully fit for purpose that they can come together and create the sweet spot, which will enable your team to perform as it really could. And this can bring a whole host of benefits to everybody involved. And how sweet would these be? Equally importantly, though, it's only when your team is realizing its full potential that it can support your organization to perform as well as it can. Now, that's not saying that optimum IC team performance will guarantee the organization performs as well as possible, because there are too many other factors involved. But we can guarantee two things. Firstly, that if you are not in that sweet spot at present, your team cannot be performing as well as it could. Now, that's not necessarily anyone's fault, it's just the way it is, possibly because of what everybody's inherited. You, your clients, the organization's leaders, everybody. However, if that is the case, the second thing we can guarantee is that your organization must be underperforming as well, because internal communication is simply so pervasive. And this means it's in everybody's interests for you to get to that sweet spot. This really should be a no-brainer. And it also means you need to think about how to ensure the skills, practice designs and mandate of all your organization's IC specialists are fit for purpose. So, where do you go from here? Well, before going any further, we need to address the issue of fitness for purpose. And we can't know if our skills, practice designs or mandate are fit for purpose without first of all defining and, in the interests of credibility, validating what that purpose is. Now, what follows may seem incredibly obvious to you. However, over the last 2 decades, I've had many IC specialists and business leaders say that what follows is blindingly obvious when you think about it. So it seems that when it comes to internal communication at least, many people appear to be overlooking the obvious simply because it hasn't occurred to them to state it. And in order to be sure we don't overlook the obvious, it would probably be worth starting by recognizing that when people are paid to produce any communications, someone has to do the paying. So any such communications have to make financial sense. But not all such communications make financial sense in the same way, because in the commercial arena there are recreational communications and there are business communications. Recreational communications would include things like newspapers and magazines, theatre plays, TV shows, concerts and the like, whereas business communications include marcoms as well as communications to customers, investors, suppliers and, of course, employees. Both types have to be able to make financial sense. But an interesting point here is that many people who work in internal communication, and even more so in internal comms, within which the internal communication function often resides, actually have a background in journalism, a discipline with its roots firmly in the recreational arena. And that becomes relevant when we consider who's paying for these communications. With business communications, it's obviously the organization that's footing the bill. But with recreational comms, if you want to read a newspaper or magazine, whose money do you have to spend? Probably your own, unless it's being paid for solely by advertising. This means that recreational communications can cover their costs and potentially generate a profit if the communicators simply get enough people to engage in the process of being communicated with. Nothing beyond that is required because, in essence, the communication is the commercial product. But because it's the organization that has to pay for business communications, that recreational endgame is demonstrably unfit for purpose, and even more so when the communication is internal, because the organization not only has to pay to get the message in front of its audience, it then also has to pay the audience for its time to receive that message. So such communications can justify their existence only through the actions that employees are taking or perhaps avoiding once the communication process is over. So it's demonstrably the case that all internal communications must directly and or indirectly prompt and or enable people within the organization to take and or avoid actions of some kind, either straight away or at some point in the future. Now, some internal comms may be stimulating those actions indirectly by simply helping people to feel good about their employer or colleagues. But the crucial thing here is that it is the actions themselves that provide the payback. This is logically inescapable, and it's also not the whole story, because it's perfectly possible to get employees engaging in all manner of activities that are of no value to the organization. So we could say that what we've identified thus far is the functional purpose of internal communication. But is this purpose valid? Well, we can validate it in two ways. One way would be to look at the consequences of not fulfilling it, which in this case would mean that those communications are simply consuming employee time with no payback, something we've already shown to be commercially indefensible. However, that still leaves the possibility of prompting and enabling unproductive actions. So we need to consider a second validation question. What's the purpose of that purpose? Or more specifically, what's the purpose of prompting and enabling people within the organization to take or avoid actions? And this leads us to the ultimate purpose of internal communication, which is to help the organization fulfill its very reason for being as efficiently and effectively as possible, and whenever appropriate, perpetually increase its ability to do so. And of course we need to check if this ultimate purpose is valid. So first of all, what would happen if internal communication weren't doing this? Well, if those communication activities weren't helping people deliver the organization's purpose, they would simply be acting as a drag on those people's time and the organization's money. And the purpose of helping the organization fulfill its raison d'etre as efficiently and effectively as possible? Well, surely that's what any and every business activity should be doing, shouldn't it? What other possible valid purpose could there be? So I think we can be confident that both these functional and ultimate purposes of internal communication can withstand the most critical of scrutiny. So with these two purposes now clear and valid, what will it take for you to get into the sweet spot which will enable you to fulfill them as efficiently and elegantly as possible from here onwards? Well, there are 4 more parts to this video book which can guide you step by step towards the sweet spot. The first of these will cover the key things you need to take into account to ensure the sweet spot you're aiming for is both complete and viable. What do you really need? And what are the obstacles you might need to overcome? This part of the book lays it all out for you. Then you'll know what to look for when we consider the design of your current practices. What are the key practices you'll probably need to review, and what are some of the things which may be quietly undermining their total fitness for purpose? Beyond that, there's the question of how to put together a robust financial business case for change, which you may well need even if your new sweet spot isn't going to require any additional budget, but particularly if it is. And finally, we address the issue of getting other people to play along, because there's no point in having demonstrably fit for purpose practices and skills if other people won't let you work with them in that new way. So if you'd like to, you can crack straight on with part 2 about defining your sweet spot. Of course, if you don't have time to watch the whole book at the moment, you can dip in and out as you wish, or just make a note in your calendar now to come back when you've enough time. If you think this book might be something your colleagues, your boss, or members of your network might be interested in, by all means share it with them. And if you have any questions about what we've covered so far, by all means get in touch.